We're about to hit 1,000 people, so let's start for real. Good morning to all of y'all. Thank you for being here with us. It's earlier in the morning for those of you on the West Coast than it is for those of us here, so I really appreciate y'all. We are joined this morning by Jake Sullivan and Jon Feiner, for those of you who don't already know them, but you may remember them. They're both committed public servants. They have amazing resumes. They're both proof that you can get a law degree and still do valuable and important work. Most recently, Jake was Joe Biden's national security advisor. Jon was the deputy national security advisor. And so we're incredibly lucky to have them with us this morning to help sort out what's going on in Venezuela. If you like what you hear this morning, it's important for you to know that they have a brand new podcast. They've just started it. It drops every Friday, and it's called The Long Game, something that increasingly we'll all have on our radar screens this year. I'd really encourage y'all to follow the podcast and take a listen so that we can all be smarter in areas that will be increasingly important for us to be. Tuesday morning, for those of you who listen to Preet Bharara's and my Insider podcast, Preet and I will take on the Maduro indictment, and we'll discuss the legal aspects of the situation. But this morning, I really want to spend some time discussing where are we and what comes next. That's what we all need to know right now. So we'll start there. But first, will y'all just give us a sense? What does the National Security Advisor and his team do? And what would both of you be doing right now if you were still in those roles?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us, and thanks to everyone for joining. And we really do hope that people will give a listen to The Long Game wherever you get your podcasts. As Joyce said, it drops every Friday. We'll have a new episode this coming Friday. My guess is we'll still be talking about Venezuela come Friday, among many other issues. The National Security Advisor has a couple of principal responsibilities. One is to be the main advisor to the President of the United States on all matters of national security. So to tee up recommendations for his decision on everything from war and peace to technology competition with China to how we engage on issues of trade and economics. But then the second is to coordinate the policy process of the U.S. government. So the National Security Advisor works with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the CIA, and comes together at that what's called the principles table to try to formulate and then coordinate the execution of U.S. foreign policy and national security. And that coordination mechanism is really important. Now, currently, the National Security Advisor is Marco Rubio. He also happens to be the Secretary of State. I didn't think I had spare time when I was National Security Advisor, but he apparently has the time to do both jobs. And now President Trump has tapped him also to run Venezuela. So he will have a third very big job here imminently. I make light of that a bit, although it's obviously a very serious issue. But that's what we did for President Biden.
Criteria is personal loyalty. The pool of talent you have to draw on is pretty limited.
Well said. Well said. So that's what Jon and I did for President Biden. We were in the room in the Oval Office advising him. We were in the Situation Room with our colleagues, running all of these senior national security departments. And dealing with all of the questions and crises that arose over the last 4 years. And so when we look at something like Venezuela, we're looking at it from the perspective of people who have sat in those rooms, who have seen our U.S. military actually execute in incredible fashion as well. President Trump was describing what happened in this military operation. But that we're trying to process all of this in real time along with the rest of the people on this Substack Live, but doing so with that perspective of having been in the room.
Yeah, I mean, what do y'all make of the reports in the New York Times that there was, what in government speak folks might call collateral damage, that there were actually people who were killed, property that was damaged during the diversionary attack?
Oh, look, in an operation like this, that is virtually guaranteed to happen. Part of the operational planning process that Jake described, where you're sitting around the table and the people who will actually be doing the military operation describe what they plan to do. One of the things we would do in that situation is ask exactly this kind of question. Do you expect there to be people killed, people wounded, who are innocent in the course of this operation? I hope and expect maybe that those questions were asked. I don't think we've got good yet detailed on the ground reporting about how much of that sort of damage has been caused, or, I think very specific reporting, although President Trump alluded to it, the possibility of some U.S. Forces at least being injured in this. I think those details will come out over time. But that is one of the areas you really want to dig into before launching into something very complicated and very high risk like this. It was very well executed, it looks like, operationally, as Jake said, but there's a lot of risk associated with these sorts of operations, and I hope that they were asking those questions.
Can we talk for a second about why? I mean, I understand, and everybody, I assume, that's with us has been following along and understanding that the technical excuse for doing this involves perhaps executing the arrest of someone who is under indictment in the United States. That's one potential way of looking at this. The other is, of course, as part of the war on narco-terrorism, although I find it personally a little bit difficult to take that seriously, given Trump's recent pardon of, the former president of, I'm blanking on the country.
Honduras.
Yes.
Yes.
Someone who was convicted following a jury trial and faced serious custodial time. And Trump pardoned him, saying something about, well, I didn't think Biden was serious about that. So the whole narco-terrorism war is a little bit difficult to take seriously. Can we talk a little bit about Venezuela's geopolitical significance? There's been a lot of talk about oil. To some extent, there's been talk about gold. Do you think that plays a role here?
Well, you know what, Joyce? You make a very good point on the drugs. So first, the major drug that threatens the lives of Americans is fentanyl. You'll notice in the entire indictment against Nicolas Maduro, the word fentanyl doesn't appear because fentanyl is not coming from Venezuela. Cocaine does transit Venezuela, but a lot of it goes to Europe, not to the United States. In fact, some of the boats they were blasting out of the water were likely transporting cocaine to Suriname and then on to Europe. And then, as you point out, if President Trump really cared about drugs, and especially cocaine, he would not have pardoned the president of Honduras, a man who personally trafficked tons of cocaine into the United States and actually said at one point he wanted to shove cocaine up the noses of gringos. This guy, Trump pardoned, said, I'm giving him a clean bill of health. So I think the drugs excuse holds no water. So then some people might claim it's about democracy. This guy's a dictator, an illegitimate president. And in fact, Nicolas Maduro was a totally illegitimate dictator and a thug. But you heard President Trump yesterday basically say, I don't care about the opposition. I'm happy to work with Maduro's henchmen and other people from his regime as long as they will, and this is the kicker, give American oil majors access to oil in Venezuela. And for me, I think that is the dominant rationale for why they have done this, and it is the thing that is shaping their policy going forward. Let us get access to Venezuela's oil. Let Exxon and Chevron and the other American oil companies make massive profits off of that. And we are going to kind of execute a sort of occupation by joystick, holding a gun to the head of Venezuela, to make sure they give us their oil. I wouldn't have necessarily said that a week ago. Oil had been in the picture, but President Trump has made it absolutely clear. This is the motivation for why this is happening. There is also some talk of minerals like gold and so forth, and I'm sure that's on his mind. But I think oil is the dominant issue.
Trump is very transactional. I mean, he does very little out of the goodness of his own heart. As a prosecutor, I'm trained to follow the money. So that obviously is something that when we start talking about resources, oil companies, that pops into one's mind. How concerned should we be that this is about personal gain and not about politics? Or is it premature to speculate?
Look, I think the track record of the last year suggests that there tends to be an element of either personal gain or gain for close associates and friends tied to many of the policy decisions, including the foreign and national security policy decisions that are made by this administration. So it's hard, I would say basically impossible, to give them the benefit of the doubt on that. I think the assumption should be that there's something there, and maybe it's incumbent upon them to demonstrate otherwise. And President Trump's press conference yesterday, in which he again talked, as Jake said, about executives of American companies wanting to get access to Venezuela, suggests a few things. One, that there may be this element of either personal or close associates' financial gain. But two, he has also tried to portray this as a sort of simple law enforcement operation. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, also made that point. Anyone questioning the legality of this should, and I know you will dig into this with Preet, should take into account that the United States has indicted these people and has every right to go in and grab them. But you'll notice that the press conference President Trump held, it was not the FBI director or the attorney general who were standing there next to him. It was the Secretary of Defense. And it wasn't, the upcoming court proceedings that were being described. It was a military operation, including the likelihood that the United States will now have to, quote unquote, run Venezuela for the foreseeable future. I don't think of law enforcement agencies as being involved in running countries. That is the kind of thing you do when you occupy or control a country militarily, which it seems like is on the agenda. Again, very different from how this is being characterized in other contexts.
I mean, that seems to me to be the heart of this. We're listening to the press conference. It's a little bit rambling. Trump then makes this comment about we're going to take over Venezuela. We're going to run Venezuela, at least until a transition that's acceptable to us can be arranged. Do y'all take that seriously? Was this Trump just popping off in the moment, or is this policy that was devised in advance of this strike?
I would say both and. It was Trump popping off in the moment. And in fact, Marco Rubio this morning sort of rode back a little bit of the, we're running Venezuela commentary. But at the end of the day, the biggest question you have to ask after America conducts a military strike on a foreign country is what then? And that's the question that the Trump administration is currently stuck with. And so their answer seems to be, we're just going to tell the people in Caracas, even if they're just Maduro cronies, we don't really care who is sitting in Caracas as long as they do what we tell them. And if they don't, as Trump threatened and Rubio implied today, we'll hit them again. That is, in my view, as I was saying before, a kind of occupation by joystick. It's like sitting outside the country with this huge military force in the Caribbean, which, by the way, costs the American taxpayer an enormous sum of money day in, day out. And basically saying to Venezuela, do as we tell you, or we'll drop more bombs, kill more people, potentially, grab more people. That seems to be the strategy at the moment. And their hope is that the current leadership in Venezuela, which is the same regime that Maduro came from, it's not like a new dawn of democracy in that country, will just comply. And the demand seems to be, let our oil companies in. Now, there is a big question, which some of the people in the comments are pointing out, as to whether American oil companies want to go into Venezuela beyond Chevron, who's been there for quite some time. That's a great question. And almost certainly, President Trump and the people around him will demand some personal benefit out of that. But that, it does seem like we are not going to try to go into Caracas, although Trump didn't take boots off the ground off the table, or boots on the ground off the table. But mostly it seems like we are going to engage in the gunboat diplomacy of the earlier eras, where the United States essentially holds a gun to the head of countries in our hemisphere and tells them to do what we want.
So I want to talk about the map of succession in Venezuela right now. But before we get there, can I ask y'all about this report that the United Nations Security Council will meet on Monday? Do you expect anything to come of that? We obviously have veto power. The European response has been, I think, surprisingly lackadaisical, right? A lot of leaders weighing in to say Maduro was a horrible person and this isn't the time to talk about whether or not the U.S. action was legal. But what do y'all make of that? Will the UN play any realistic role here?
So I guess what I'd say to that is I suspect there probably will be some kind of a meeting. Even if you have a veto, there are ways to force a meeting onto the agenda if a country that's on the Security Council is sufficiently motivated to do that. But in terms of any actual action coming out of the Security Council, quite obvious, the United States will never allow that. So it would be the kind of meeting where countries get together, they say a bunch of things, the United States defends what it did, maybe some other countries speak on behalf of the United States, a bunch of countries, probably Russia, China, maybe a few others say some negative things, and you get on with your life. I would not expect the Security Council to intervene in any sort of way, exactly for the reason that you indicated, because there's a veto. I agree with you, by the way, that the international response here has been pretty interesting. There have been some strong condemnations from a few countries in the region, from Mexico, from Colombia, which you'd expect. Colombia, by the way, is another country that could be in the crosshairs, which Trump made quite explicit in his news conference. From Brazil and President Lula, who Trump has had a pretty tumultuous relationship with, from a couple of other regional countries. But internationally, beyond that, other than Russia and China, mostly people have been keeping their powder dry. And it seems like that is largely because they do not see this as a fight they want to pick with the Trump administration when they have so many other fights outstanding. It's a bit disappointing, candidly, to see the Europeans so tepid in their response to this. And they seem to basically be trying to stay out of the crosshairs and allowing this to play out for the time being.
Look, ultimately, the Europeans, their number one issue is Ukraine. And they have spent the last year trying to stay on Trump's good side to the maximum extent possible to keep him in a better place on Ukraine. Whether that will actually work out in the end, given that he consistently reverts to taking Putin's side, is another question. But I think in their minds, Venezuela is not a top priority. And therefore, as Jon said, no reason for them to pick a fight. That's just cold, hard realism for most of them. Some of them are doing an interesting thing, though. For example, President Macron gave a quite tepid statement. Then his foreign minister went out and said the whole thing's illegal. So I think they're also adopting strategies where the leaders will say one thing and then their foreign ministries will say another thing to try to get on the record, but not get in Trump's crosshairs.
Can we also talk about where China fits into this picture? Obviously, Venezuela is strategically located in our own hemisphere. China, no surprise to anyone, has attempted to play an increasing role there. How should we understand all of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the China hawks in the administration are trying to portray this action as in some way aimed at keeping China and maybe even Russia to some extent out of the hemisphere. Obviously, their main entree into the Western Hemisphere has been countries like Venezuela, with which they are closely associated economically, primarily. I don't think this had anything to do with China in terms of the administration's motivation. There have been a couple of other interesting developments. In China itself, in their sort of social media chatter, there has been a lot of discussion about this operation in Venezuela. People saying things like they don't like it, it shows how aggressive the United States is in the world, but also potentially that it could be a model or at least a justification if China wants to throw its weight around, assert itself in the international arena in places like the South China Sea and maybe even Taiwan, which is obviously the biggest ticket, kind of highest stakes potential crisis on the international agenda. Look, I don't think this makes it any more likely that China will take action when it comes to Taiwan. But what it does, which I think is damaging to the United States, is it makes it harder for America to portray other countries' aggressive actions, whether that's Russia, waging a war of aggression on Ukraine for several years, or the possibility of China waging an aggressive war on Taiwan or even its other neighbors, makes it harder for the United States to say that stuff is totally out of bounds. That stuff is beyond what acceptable civilized countries should do when we are going about this sort of activity. So in terms of building an international kind of coalition of countries to help the United States compete with countries like Russia and China, I do think this undermines the credibility, although that credibility has been pretty badly shredded by this administration for more than a year.
And Joyce, the reason that we call our podcast The Long Game is because we try to look beyond just the next 24, 48, 72 hours. So there are two big implications of this that really concern me. One, which goes to what Jon was just saying, is essentially this Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the U.S. will control the Western Hemisphere, is a bit of a pathway to a spheres of influence world where Russia controls its backyard, China controls its backyard, and America controls its backyard. I think that is not a good world for the United States. But I think if you're sitting in Beijing or Moscow right now, the main lesson you're taking away from this is Trump is kind of buying into your idea that the big countries, the strong men, run things in their neighborhoods. And that's going to have a big impact on how you make decisions going forward. The second thing is, I think the Trump administration is getting addicted to these military adventures. A guy who came in saying he wanted to end wars, I think he kind of likes this stuff. And so I'm worried that this is going to lead to further military action in Iran, potentially further military action in the hemisphere. Jon mentioned Colombia. Mexico was a country thrown out by President Trump yesterday. And then you may have noticed that Katie Miller, Stephen Miller's wife, yesterday posted this photo of Greenland with an American flag covering it. I think these guys' theory is if we can go basically take military action in Venezuela for resource extraction, then why don't we go ahead and grab Greenland for its minerals and its strategic position? Never mind that Greenland is part of Denmark, a NATO ally of the United States. So I think there's a lot to be worried about from both of these vectors, further American military action and a spheres of influence world that I think ultimately leaves the United States far less safe.
You know, early in this administration, when Trump started out by talking about Greenland and taking over Greenland, I paid serious attention to that as a threat. And as has so often been my experience in the past decade, I was essentially told not to be a drama queen, that it was nothing, that it was just bluster. But because of Greenland's strategic significance, it seems very serious to me. And the Danish ambassador was quick to respond yesterday. Is that really a flashpoint, or is that just Katie Miller and a meme?
Look, if you had asked me a year ago, I'll let Jon jump in here. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said there's going to be a lot of big talk. But I think this action in Venezuela and their sense that, oh, this was great, I think whets their appetite for doing things that really push beyond any boundaries that we would consider to be, legitimate. And that makes me worried about Greenland. I don't know, Jon, what you think.
Oh, look, Trump came in with a squeamishness about the use of force that in some ways was reassuring to those of us who were worried about, lack of expertise surrounding the president, lack of a kind of a formal, rigorous decision-making process. The fact that his risk appetite has gone way up over the course of this last year is a pretty significant harbinger of what he could do over the next few years. So you can't categorically rule out something with regard to Greenland. Or, by the way, in addition to Colombia and Mexico, the other countries in the hemisphere that have been mentioned, they are also kind of saber-rattling when it comes to Cuba, too. Long-standing kind of a foil for U.S. foreign policy and a primary interest of Secretary of State / National Security Advisor / maybe Governor General of Venezuela, Marco Rubio. And so, while all of this stuff seems like you're playing the board game Risk, it almost seems like stuff from the movies. What they have done already suggests that you cannot rule out any possibilities. And I know that other countries around the world and in the region are taking these things very seriously.
I mean, if you're Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, how worried are you right now?
I think they've been worried even before this action because there have been a lot of reports that the U.S. was planning some military strikes in Mexico. I think that concern factor has gone through the roof after President Trump's comments yesterday. She has nonetheless been quite tough and direct in her response to what happened here. But I'm sure she's sitting down with her people and saying, what is the likelihood that the U.S. acts against us in some way now that, President Trump's appetite has grown with the eating? And she's got to be thinking, okay, what are the cards I have to play to try to deal with that? I think similarly, Petro in Colombia, and as Jon just mentioned in Cuba, they're probably all thinking, hey, if President Trump thinks this was good, let's do more of this, that they could be in the crosshairs too.
Something that really sets Venezuela apart from others, and the irony here is so rich that I almost can't get these words out of my mouth, but it's the fact that Maduro's last election fell seriously into question, as did the legitimacy of his leadership. Can you set the table and help us understand what happened there? Is Maduro a legitimate leader? There's some thought that if he, in fact, is legitimately the leader of his country, the head of state, he might even have immunity from prosecution. And I think that we're about to hear from the administration the argument that he's not a legitimate head of state, hence he can be prosecuted. But how do you all assess this most recent election?
Well, look, one area in which I think we are pretty closely aligned with the Trump administration and with the first Trump administration is that President Maduro is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela. And the election that you referenced in 2024 took place while we were still in office. And it was quite clear, both from very courageous, very effective reporting on the ground by pro-democracy parties in Venezuela and by our own U.S. government analysis, that this election was stolen. by Nicolas Maduro, and won by Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate, who's backed by Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel laureate, who is probably the most famous pro-democracy person in the context of Venezuela. So it is quite clear that Maduro is not the legitimate leader. What that means for his indictment and for sovereign immunity or anything else, I'll let you and Preet dig into. What that means for the sort of strategic wisdom of doing this, or the legitimacy from a policy perspective of doing this, I think is pretty minimal, to be honest. There are plenty of leaders around the world that the United States has considered, could consider illegitimate because the elections that produce them, or the lack of election that produce them, people take over militarily, people take over government in all kinds of ways. That leads us to consider them not particularly legitimate. We don't go all around the world with the Delta Force taking them from power and absconding with them to the United States. So there's a reason we don't do that. And I think one point that hasn't come out in this conversation that's quite important is that these things sometimes look very good in the moment. The operation was well executed. It's kind of intimidating, I think, to countries around the world in a good way that the United States military is able to do these things. They often age badly over time when it becomes clear that we have not fully thought through the aftermath and where all this is going. And nothing that we have seen in the first 24 hours or so of this experience has suggested that this administration has particularly seriously thought through how Venezuela will be governed, how, if at all, it will ever transition to a more effective government from the current regime that is still in control, and how the United States will do this, as Jake said, by essentially remote control or joystick from outside the country without having to put forces back in a significant way, which would be a big deal.
You know, Jake, you touched on this earlier, but what do you make of the fact that Trump is focused on dealing with Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president who was elected along with Maduro, and really not talking with the opposition? Is that, given the fact that regime change maybe shouldn't be top of the list for the United States as a policy agenda, is that maybe reassuring, or are you concerned about that?
Well, it is a weird thing to say that you're part of the reason that you've gone and grabbed this guy is because he's an illegitimate ruler, and then say, we're very happy to deal with his vice president, who is part of the same illegitimate cabal running the country. And I don't think it suggests that this is going to go well at all for the people of Venezuela. And I think what's interesting is they've gone beyond not really focusing on Machado, Maria Corina Machado. He flat out said she doesn't have the support. And Rubio followed up today by basically saying you can't count on the opposition. So they're kind of doubling down on saying we're going to work with the guys in charge. I'm not for regime change wars. Just let me be absolutely clear about that. But I find it quite interesting that the entire sum total of this effort seems to be to get a pliant dictator in charge in Caracas who allow American oil companies to come into Venezuela. I think this is a crazy policy for the United States of America. And as Jon said, I think it will not age well.
I mean, if anything seems to underscore the fact that this is about oil and other interests as opposed to some form of at least quasi-lawful action, I think it's how they're handling the transition. What should we be watching for in the next day, the next week? What's at top of mind for both of y'all?
So I'd have a few things on my list. One is taking a step back from the politics and from the U.S. role. What is the basic level of stability, security, protest activity in the streets of Venezuela? How are people reacting to this? Are people trying to kind of take advantage of a possible vacuum in terms of authority in the country? Are we devolving into a possibility of even something akin to a failed state? So the basic situation on the ground in Venezuela is something I'd be watching very closely. Then, who is effectively in charge? Is it Delcy Rodriguez, who is the vice president who, under their constitution, assumes control, at least in the near term, if the president is no longer able to perform his duties? Is it some other figure from the security establishment, from the intelligence community in Venezuela, from the military in Venezuela? These are the people that have the ability to actually impose their will on others in Venezuelan society. And I don't think they're going to sort of sit idly by and quietly and allow others to sort of dictate terms. So who actually takes control of the country internally? And then third, for me, is, does the U.S. believe that it is getting what it says it wants and deserves, which is in large part access, I think, for American oil companies. But maybe there are some other demands too. And if it becomes clear that this new authority which is really the old authority, is sort of thumbing its nose at Donald Trump and Marco Rubio. Does the U.S. get sucked deeper into Venezuela, including militarily, which I think is the biggest ticket question from the perspective of Americans and our policy? So that would be my list.
I think Jon nailed it. The only thing that I would add is there was a report in the New York Times today that in the first Trump administration, they actually ran a war game on what would happen if they removed Maduro from power. And what they found is that the most likely scenario was Venezuela would somehow descend into chaos. So what I worry most about is there's a power struggle in Caracas, or there's a power vacuum in Caracas over time, and that the country becomes even more unstable, more problematic, and frankly, more a haven for the drug traffickers that Trump, quote unquote, claims to have been trying to go against. So I think that's something to watch for as well. Those dynamics of whether or not Delcy Rodriguez can actually control the country going forward is something worth watching closely.
I can't thank you both enough for spending time with us this morning. I know I promised you 20 minutes and we're a little bit over time, but this has been unbelievably informative. I'm really excited to get to listen to your podcast, The Long Game. It has just jumped to the top of my list of must listen to podcasts in the coming weeks. So thank you for that as well. Preet and I are looking forward to getting to interact with you guys over time as all of this comes forward. Please come back and update us when you get a chance to do that. Will y'all come back?
Anytime.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Thank you to all of you who listened this morning. I'll send out the video once it's ready so you can share it with friends. Everyone, have a good day. Stay informed.
Thank you.